Antique Prometheus by Spike Marshall, read by Pine.
At one point, I suppose the Prometheus would have been a sight to behold. A lunatic affectation nestled in a poor northern town. Pictures from its peak revealed an opulence of red velvet and golden art deco. No one knew how the old Victorian theatre had turned into a cinema, although whispers abounded that at one point it may have been an adult cinema. In time it had become more legitimate, but it still had a reputation for weird and wonderful fare. As I found myself within the charred remains of the building, I felt a profound sense of melancholy for the place. The fire had occurred decades ago, but the cinema had never been demolished. Instead, it was left to mummify on the grim streets, with graffiti-covered wood awnings being the only thing keeping people out. The floor creaked under my feet as the moonlight picked its way through various holes in the ceiling, creating cold, eerie pillars that illuminated the cavernous gloom. The December evening was surprisingly balmy, but within this spider-splintered skeleton of the cinema, a chill set in. For a moment, I held my breath and allowed the rhythm of the place to overtake me. The creak of the carbonized floor beneath my feet, the jangle of a breeze that wound through the rafters, the scurrying of industrious rats, bats, and owls that had made this carcass their home. But beneath those noises was something else, something ancient and ardent. The whispering of lost voices, the click-clack of a spooled projector, and in the air, the sickly sweet scent of popcorn. I'd been brought here by rumours that this cinema still held life, even in death. That during witching hours, on clear nights, the husk restored to its former glory, and ghostly audiences could be spotted watching spectral cinema in the black of night. I wasn't the first interested party to come. Ghost hunters, paranormal experts, even a Look North crew had come to investigate. All of them had come away haunted, but inconclusive still. Something existed here, though. That was for sure. I opened my eyes and walked to the burnt altar that had once been a kiosk. The remnants of glass exploded and blackened. A piece of wood jutted out from the counter, sharp and angular. I placed my finger against it. The smallest pressure almost broke the skin. The cold was stronger now, pinching at my bones as I walked to the stairwell that once led to the balcony. I perched on the step, looking up at the moon through a hole punched in the ceiling. Despite my apprehension, I allowed myself to close my eyes and be fully enveloped by the place. The world was black now. I focused on my breathing and allowed myself again to truly hear this mausoleum of a movie house. At first, the sounds were what I had heard before. The creaking and groaning of a tattered building, with that faint undercurrent of what this place had been. But then, as if carried on the tide, the sounds of people broke through. Laughing and joking and chattering. Then footfalls, quietly at first, and then the cacophony of a crowd. I suddenly became aware of being observed, my entire body feverish with dread. Taking what courage I had left, I opened my eyes and saw that the charred wood was no more. Instead, the cinema was back in all its glory. Golden Art Deco fixtures, green wallpaper, red curtains and drapes, a patterned purple carpet. It was gaudy and glorious in equal measure, and everywhere I looked there were people dressed 40 years out of time, served by diligent staff, all in matching purple uniforms. I stood up and walked to the kiosk, none of the visitors or staff paying me any mind. I made to speak to the girl who attended it, but she would not look me in the eye. Her face was turned down to the counter, diligent in her work. I looked to the crowd and found that I could not make eye contact with any of them, nor even get a proper look at their faces. They'd turn if observed, or another would walk in front and block me, confounding me. I navigated this anonymous sea, and then spied that the door to the main auditorium was now open. Above me, in the projection booth, there was a shuddering roar as ancient machinery roused itself to life. Light burst from the door to the auditorium, and, moth-like, I walked towards it. Passing through the entrance, I found myself in the main cinema. There were rows and rows of red chairs, and on the screen a movie played that no living person had seen in nearly 100 years. This was why I had sought out the Prometheus, summoned my courage, and decided to spend the night. The stories I had heard were that this spectral cinema not only served the dead, but played the ghosts of films, movies that had been lost, or that should have been but never were, negatives destroyed, scenes on cutting room floors, ideas that never came to pass. The movie on the screen was an old Hitchcock film, Lost to Time. It was The Mountain Eagle, released in the 1920s, but unloved and uncared for. In the mortal world, it existed only as a handful of stills, but here it was playing in its full glory. I stood and watched, daring not to sit in one of the empty seats. As the credits rolled, I felt blessed to have been able to see it, but also became aware again of being observed. As the lights in the auditorium rose to a dim half-light, I saw a crowd that now craned and turned in their seats to stare at me. Yet still, within the dank of the cinema, I could not make out the details of their faces. All I knew was that I had been anonymous, and now I was not. In front of me, there was an empty seat that beckoned me, called to me. I knew if I took my seat I would be treated to another screening, and who knows what treasures I would see. I walked forward, avoiding the gaze of the haunted crowd, and took the seat next to a small child. The gaslight lamps dimmed, and for a second I felt like I should never have a need to leave this place. I allowed myself to focus on the screen, but a gnawing, terrible thought entered my mind. A desire to truly see who else occupied this cinema. I gritted my teeth and turned to look at the child who sat beside me. Initially, the child turned from me, as all the others had, but I kept my eyes fixed, and it slowly turned to face me. At first, the child was just a child, nothing out of the ordinary. My heart eased and my breath calmed. But then, in the half-light detail, I saw that its skin was porcelain white, smudged with black smoke stains that emanated from what I had mistaken for eyes. Ringed with embered skin, there was nothing there but a charred hollow, a void where the window to the soul should have been. But within that void was a pinprick of light, the cold spark of something inhuman that pierced into me. My feet felt heavy. My body yearned to just fold into the seat and watch the next film, but my mind was screaming. Summoning all my strength, I threw myself up and back into the aisle. I looked up and saw flame roaring from the projection porthole, and the crowd still seated now, but screaming in fear. I bolted out of the auditorium, back into the lobby. There, the smell of burning was overpowering, unseen smoke stinging at my eyes. The spectral customers all stared at me now, blocking the entrances, blocking the stairs. The unseen smoke was acrid and thick, choking me, enveloping me. I stumbled back to the kiosk and tried to remember how it had looked before. I remembered the splinter of wood jutting up, and in desperation I threw my hand at where I remembered it being. The pain was sharp and powerful, It was all I could focus on as the wooden spear stabbed and ripped at my palm. Blood ran down and onto the charred wood of the counter, and as I looked around, the Prometheus was back to being a burnt shell. Gripping my hand, I ran out onto the street. I gasped as I looked to see fresh snowfall on this December evening. It was too warm for snow, no frost in the air, and yet here it lay. But as I observed it more and saw the flecks fall, I realised it was the apparition of ash pluming from the remains of the Prometheus. I turned back to the ruins, and in the corner of my eye, for a shard of a second, it was how it had been. Regal and beautiful, consumed in hellish fire and the sounds of screams. But as I fully turned, all that was left was the shell, and a grim, silent night.